Hello, everybody, and happy Sunday. It's your boy Vlhadus, and today we have a Q&A from Yokai's Theater. It's their 6-year anniversary for their Ashes Creations discussion podcast with Steven Sharif. I have the whole thing recorded, but I have it completely condensed down to where if you don't have a whole hour and some to watch this video, here you go. So here's all the different questions with Steven Sharif's answers. Let's get into it.
Well, I would say that if anyone is looking right now and thinks there's too much healing in ashes, we haven't even yet gotten to Alpha 2 with an opportunity to balance. I think that it's important to note that nobody, gosh, I guess maybe there are some people out there who like easy games, but for me, I really enjoy high difficulty, and I think the ratio of healing and the time to kill, those are all elements of a certain type of skill ceiling and reaction time, and what is expected out of the encounters or out of PvP. Ashes aims to be a more difficult leveling experience than perhaps we have been accustomed to over the past decade of MMO gameplay. And with that in mind, when it comes to balancing during Alpha 2 and thereafter, um, there is not going to be an a overage of healing that's available. We will tune those things. We'll have an opportunity to balance those things. Um, yeah, I think it's gonna be I think it's gonna be a good healthy amount of that. Nobody likes an easy experience. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you guys, and what mains you play in MMOs. I tend to play a lot of different classes, and healer is definitely one of my mains. I think you need to have a balance in any class kit that is predictive and reactive, right? Those are two different types of skills that players are, wanting to engage with so that they can perform well. And it really, when you get that motion of knowing when you should start casting a heal versus having your oh shit buttons that you can rely on if the situation doesn't go as you anticipated, that's the type of rhythm that you enjoy as a healer, and making sure that your like resource management is not being depleted and that you have sustainability and longevity in that, right? So when we architect these class kits and the types of skills and abilities that exist for the healer, we keep in mind those two aspects, the predictive nature and the reactive nature. Funny enough, we were just iterating, the combat team was iterating on the fighter class, and some of the debuff options that the fighter class has within their class kit are debuffs that can reduce received healing on the target, right? So like like all things, there are give and takes. There are options that you want to leverage, and you need to be strategic and tactical in the timings of those applications of those particular types of effects, and being specific on the targets you want to you know confer those effects to. So there is counterplay there, right? That is an important part of the class design. Yeah, and we haven't yet done a highlight of the fighter class kit. I think to the degree we have with the cleric, right? But the combat team just got off of two different sprints, I think, iterating on the fighter. Speaking of those class mechanics, there is one in particular called momentum, um, that I think plays to this class fantasy of. I don't know if you ever watched the X-Men's where they have that Juggernaut character and he's like running through the walls and he's just an unstoppable, like, crazy force. That's how I kind of envision a fighter on the battlefield, right? The more he's taking damage, the more he's dealing damage, the higher his resistances become, the rage effects start to take, place. He's outputting damage and getting faster. Like that is the type of class fantasy I want to see on a battlefield for a fighter. And I know Trad and Brian are working with the combat team to ensure that that's the case. I think we're going to have a good update for the fighter coming up. One of the things we talked about early on with regards to Guild Wars is that there are dynamically spawning objective based gameplay that exists for Guild Wars. And historically, I think what most of us are accustomed to when it comes to the MMO type Guild War expectation is just a simple kill count, right, from the players. And
Yeah.
that's usually defined within some set period of time. And at the end of that set period of time, the highest kill count, wins. That is a very binary conclusion, and it isn't always very rewarding. But
Yeah,
when
I
we
mean,
talk,
we've all seen this strategy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean
yeah,
to cut you off.
yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, and
Kill
it, and
2
it,
people
it
in town and everybody go away.
exactly right. Everyone log out. We're up on
Yeah.
kills. It's like how anticlimactic is that? So, one thing that's important to note is our guild wars have objective based gameplay that spawn in the world based on several different factors and predicates that might exist. Some of those predicates might be: where is your guild a patron guild of? Does your guild have a guild hall? What node is your guild leader and or officers a citizen of? What was your last completed raid boss? Like, all of those can serve as predicates to then spawn a certain objective within the world that players have to either engage with in a number of different manners. Either they can be kill objectives, they can be control objectives, they can be capture and move objectives, they could be caravan summons that need to take supplies from those objectives. Like, the idea is to incorporate all of these other ancillary systems that exist within the game in some way, shape, or form, tie it into the guild war, because we've created those systems for a reason. We want players to engage with those systems. So why not hook those systems into the guild war format? And I think that that creates a very dynamic setting where it is not just about killing and logging out, but rather strategy in both your resource placement, how you respond and when you respond, the composition of your raid slash group teams, those types of things play a role now in the outcome of those guild wars. And I think they keep it fresh because it'll be different per war.
That that's that's great to hear. That's great to hear. I love how you guys are like keeping that focus on the open worldness of it and just like the objective based things. That I think a lot of people are going to be really excited to hear that.
Yeah, and
And
and it makes sense, right? Because a lot, like I said, a lot of these systems are already created for other purposes,
mm,
right? And the name of the game when making an MMO is: where can you dual purpose or repurpose pre-existing logic and or assets across a number of different engagements with the player. And if you think about what an MMO really is anyways, it's a collection of different game loops in one game experience, right? That is the crux of an MMO. um, and doing that with your friends. So it just makes sense for us to repurpose those types of systems into Guild War. There are five different castle layouts that exist because there are five different static castles. And then within the static layouts, there is the ability to deploy traps and blockades if you're the defender. And you may also purchase and or achieve mercenaries through engaging with the dedicated castle nodes in the preceding weeks to the siege. And those mercenary placements can be mobile mercenaries or static mercenaries that defend locations, and you can assign certain order types to those NPCs. So while the hard structural environment is static and not able to be, you're not building a castle. If you own a castle, you're inheriting a historic ruined, castle that is representative of the past because it has some tie into specific types of powers that we haven't gotten into from a lore perspective yet. But or we haven't, excuse me, we haven't expressed to the community. That's something that we're going to leave for the community to find out when they play. But uh, when you place mercenaries and you place those blockades and you place those traps, that affects the level design of the castle according to the strategy you might use to defend it, right? And then corresponding on the attacking side, there's different types of siege weaponries and siege vehicles that can be leveraged as well. So there's two different formats by which Castle Siege's victory condition is for the attackers. On the attacking side, if the defending castle is not owned by a player, so the initial castle ownerships, then there is a raid boss that players will need to defeat. And your contribution to the death of that raid boss, if you're from competing guilds, will determine the victor, right? But you also have the opportunity to, if you're not currently the top guild contributing to that raid boss, try to wipe the other guilds as well during that interaction. If the castle is owned by a player, there will be a channel victory point that exists within the castle. And there might be, this is something that we're going to be testing, there might be an opportunity for the defending castle owners to determine where that channel point exists within the inner castle keep. And there could be a number of different options, right? So that plays into the strategy of those custom placed either mercenaries or traps. And by the way, just to expand on that, I I love castle-based gameplay. I love trophies, right? I like rewarding risk a lot. And for me, it's very difficult to imagine an MMO that I would want to play where there is not competition of strategic prowess that determines the outcome, right? Of these types of events, and there is not like a meaningful reward, both mechanically and from just a bragging rights perspective, that players can aim for and try to achieve. I think that it brings a lot to the game when it comes to motivations to excel, to level, to gain power, to engage those different progression loops. When there is an ultimate goal or trophy that is, not static and doesn't exist forever once you achieve it, but that you must constantly perform in order to maintain. And that's really the purpose of these castles.
Who
The
has better gear?
key to not making it a Zerg fest is by emphasizing the strategic relevance of those objectives, and then catering objectives to group play versus raid play, right? So you have a spreading of different types of objectives where only a group can compete for it versus a
Yep.
raid at a choke point. Having that distribution, it makes it so that smaller guilds have a vital role to play and can perform in environments where numbers are not always the deciding factor. There's a number of different ways that we inform the spawn timers. Some spawns aren't on timers at all. Some spawns are predicated on other world events or other world state changes. And in that sense, there will not be a cycle to it. Rather, it'll be predicated on player activity and player action. Other spawners will exist within windows of time, and some bosses and or strategically relevant objectives are pathing or have alternate spawn area and locations as well. So it's just kind of it's a mix and match of different types of spawn types. So it actually runs the spectrum of what you just said. So at first, you will likely be individually placing livestock and plants, and these will be um, uh, kind of based on your own efficiency in placing those footprints for those items. But as you gain progression within either farming tools or specific types of furniture placements, and even hired NPCs, you can move away from the low tier progression engagement with the player, which is individual placements, and start doing wide swaths of placement and painting those different types resources on the freehold. When it comes to placing furniture, those are always going to be individually placed by the user, and you can manipulate the furniture's rotation and placement and preview it before placing that as well. Actually, in Arcade, I didn't have too much of a problem with individual placement. I would have a hotbar that I would use for my inventory items, and I would place that hotbar, and I would just press the hotkey and then place, press the hotkey, place, press hotkey, place when I wanted to do that. For ours, we're likely going to have something a bit similar, although I'm not sure the UI has yet been fully completed on that. But it will be where you're individually placing until you graduate and progress with certain tools that allow you to start placing multiple at once. How do you envision the player using those? Because right now, let's say for example, you're fighting a dragon or something, and he has that fire breath.
Mm.
If if the dragon is being aggroed or controlled by your main tank, and he were to reposition the frontal cone attack in the direction of an opposing raid, then that would be a method by which you could use it. But when you say use, what do you mean by use?
Like a good example is like sometimes the boss will like put an arrow over your head, and like a
Oh,
meteor is
sure.
going to drop on your head, and it's going to
Yep.
leave a fire pool there.
Yeah.
Well, you could tell people who get that arrow, you go to this entrance because there's people
Absolutely.
trying to contest us. Let's drop the pools over there and kind of slow them
Yes.
down.
Yeah. So anytime the boss is telegraphing an ability, um, um, that is an opportunity for you to direct the location of that effect. And so, in that sense, yes, you could use a boss's mechanics in in an interesting way to affect an enemy raid or to troll your own raid, I guess. The good old fashioned way, through trial and error and experience. um, yeah, I I may not have a popular opinion on this subject with many people. I think that this is obviously a divisive one. But my expectation is that before we had things like DPS meters and combat logs telling us the very specifics of our interactions for a particular challenge, we had to use trial and error and experience to determine what was the most effective strategy in overcoming the challenge rating. And personally, as even a DM, right? As a dungeon master in D&D or in Pathfinder, uh, I I am very specific about the knowledge that my players have about their foe that they're facing, right? And I don't want them to be able to game or meta an encounter before they engage with it. And the same is true, I think, for our own personal performances in an MMORPG, because and there's another side to this coin, and I've talked about it in the past. When those types of tools are available, they can also take almost an antisocial and toxic form as well, which is excluding other players from being a part of that learning process, from being a part of that ability to adapt, overcome, and inspect. What am I doing that I should be doing differently? If I'm just reading numbers and there's a meta build out there that I need to do, then there's no point for me to experiment. There's no point for me to try something different. And a lot of the encounters that we create don't have one single right way to achieve them, right? There is not one particular meta raid composition that is it's always going to be effective in all the scenarios of the encounters that you're engaging with. And so, to that end, I think it is a more old school classical approach, and ultimately more rewarding to the players who are experiencing this game, if they have to use a little good old fashioned um, uh, uh, trial and error in order to overcome these challenge ratings. It is just a mitigating factor, right? There is no way to stop. I mean, and there's still going to be toxicity, whether we try to curb it with certain approaches or not. The question is what amount do we mitigate, and how many of those players experience the trial and error if
Yep.
it's not something we provide readily available out of the box. Sure, and that will be the case for the people who are very determined to ensure that they know that information. And like you said, unless we eliminate altogether combat logs and the UI, element of giving you combat numbers, like some people will be able to do that. The question is about mitigation. How many
Yep.
people are we allowing now to engage with the system in a trial and error focus rather than in a very empirical way. So look, before there were DPS meters, I would still try new builds. I would still try different rotations. I would still try something. And the experience of trying that was less about me looking at logs and looking at the DPS meter and more about the actual tactile nature of the engagement, the experience of that trial and error. And that's what I'm trying to simulate, right? Or at least mitigate the population who are so adverse to that experience that they're going to rely on some third party way to achieve the DPS meter. So that maybe that's idealistic. Maybe that is not going to bring the type of experience that I'm looking to achieve with this design decision. But that's the purpose of testing, and that's the point of engaging with your audience. And part of the NPC encounter design is not always going to be the same behavior tree, right? Like there will be purposefully behaviors that exist for the boss that are rolled at the time of the initial engagement, right? And so that is in an effort to keep things emergent, to keep things different, to try to, not keep a static, monotonous, engagement idea, right? And personally, I think that's a very interesting way to go about these more regularly recurring boss fights, is if there is always an opportunity for an action you didn't expect. Yeah, I think the interesting thing about the matrix of player agency and decision when it comes to optimizing the player character ability kit against the challenges that they're facing in these encounter designs or even against other players, is that you start with your archetype, you augment with your subclass, you augment with your itemization choices, you augment further by your resistances and enchantments and sockets. Each of these is a matrix of player decision that creates a different outcome for the challenges that you're facing. And um, what damage types is just another layer to that, that provides us an interesting way to present challenges or present problems to the players. I think we're leaning into that when it comes to our itemization and economy design, for keeping something that players can aim for in creating both from the crafting profession, achievement through different quests, and also through the honor favor system. Like those are things that add to your decision, your build, your kit, your build out, right? Um, and so yeah, we are leaning into that, and that's something I think that you guys are going to see as we present more of these class focused live streams and ultimately in Alpha 2. Static is boring. When you know what you're going to go up against, because there's not a lot of reason for it to change, that becomes a very boring endeavor. And when there's a lot of different complexity that exists between the multi-layered interactions of damage mitigation, resistances, damage penetration, those types of subtle. And when we think about the power scaling, like how much does the damage type influence your damage conferred to the target? It's subtle, right? But those things stack up over time. And there's an opportunity for that subtlety to be more expressed when the receiving target is, let's say, weak to that, or doesn't have excuse me, has chosen not to spec into any resistances against that. That keeps things fresh, and it also keeps a healthy level of itemization progression that's necessary for the player as well, right? Like I can be ultra focused on being very effective against some subsect of my challenges in the game, whether it be PvE or PvP. But if I want to have broad application, then my engagement with itemization progression is also going to need to be broad. And I think that is an important loop that players can engage with, because those loops should be fun. Those loops should be rewarding. And the more that you're engaging with those loops, the more your efficacy as a player is relevant.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. So there will be a loadout system that you can use in your inventory to help manage those different types of set that you can customize. So you can do a simple hotkey press and be able to swap your armors out of combat, of course, um, with a single button click. But it's also important to note that even in our warehouse design, right, completed items are universal anywhere in the world.
yeah.
So that's fine. It's only the material inventory and gatherables that are specific to location. And then the other thing to note there is that the primary item inventory system, not material, not gatherables, but item inventory system with on the character, is not subject to weight provisioning. It is a slot-based system, and there will be a healthy number of slots there as well. The inventory management system, there was a lot of push back and forth on the design team about whether that style of resource gatherables, in a almost Tetris style like spatial inventory system,
Mhm,
would be popular or not. My expectation is that it will be, but not for the simple sake of it being a spatial inventory system, but rather what that decision making confers to the user who is choosing the tools and the bags that they are leaving town to
mhm,
go and acquire resources out in the wild, because everything is acquirable. And if
mhm,
everything is acquirable and there's no throttle to that system, then it is no longer a choice. If I engage with the resource nearby, I will
mhm,
always engage with that resource. And a weight based system doesn't bring the types of unique complexities we want from bag progression that intersects with player death and player looting as well, because you can have specific types of spatial stack size benefits that are conferred to the types of bags that engage with these gatherables and raw materials. It has not changed,
mhm,
and the intent is for us to design relatively templatable effects conferred by each school of augmentation, right?
mhm,
And those effects will have a lot of shared benefits that get conferred to a particular ability when the augment gets applied. In addition, we define in the real the the Herculean aspect of that system is on the effects side. But
mhm,
if our strategy when it comes to how we address these augmented abilities from a visual effects perspective is to define the spaces in which those layered effects get accompanied, right? And each of these schools of different types of abilities from these class kits exists within our style guide of color and shape language. And then that reserved space that accompanies the projectile or accompanies the buff or accompanies whatever that type of ability is that's getting augmented, that space will be available for these effects to then accompany it. So it's a very I don't want to say procedural, but it's a templatized approach to how we are giving these bespoke school effects as augments to the primary abilities. The primary method of the gold faucet into our economy is through what you guys are aware of the systems called the certificate system. We have a different name for it internally. We haven't released what that is. It's tied into the lore, but um, essentially, when you do certain quests, or when you kill certain monsters, or when you complete certain events and or achievements, you will be granted some number of certificates, and you will take those certificates to hunting lodges that exist within different nodes around the world, and you will trade those certificates in either for a direct uh, gold value or for commodities. And if you're trading them in for commodities, those commodities are tied to the economic region where the commodity is granted. And that commodity can only be traded in at a nearby economic region. And the greater the distance is from the originating location of the commodity to the turn-in location of the commodity, is what determines the ratio of return for gold given. And the primary methods by which you must transit those commodities is through caravans and merchant ships, right? So these are sealed packages that only become unsealed either when the caravan or merchant ship is destroyed and the crate is dropped on the ground, and you can break into it over time. And that time is a variable that's determined by the type of crate, but also by your experience in that certain type of interaction. And then you can receive stolen certificates, which get turned in at a lesser value in black market locations. So we haven't gotten too much into that system yet. It's been designed for a while now, and incorporated into the Alpha 2 for testing. But essentially, that is the primary gold faucet within the game.
Do you drop those on death? Is that one of the materials that?
Certificates do drop on death. That is correct, and
Okay.
they become stolen certificates when that happens.
Okay.
But it is
Gotcha.
important to note that certificates are bound unless dropped, in which case they become the stolen certificates. And they can only be again turned into specific black market locations that are an upgrade path of the market chosen by certain nodes. So some nodes can choose to deal in black market certificates. It can be beneficial to the node, but it also comes with certain downsides. Um, and the important thing to note about these certificates is that they are also the basis of your tax economy. So you don't turn in certificates if you intend to use them for either citizenship dues or your land taxes and housing taxes. That means that you are not going to have the ability for players to RMT gold or um, uh, um, to land baron essentially without them directly engaging with the game in some way, shape, or form because those certificates are bound. How do we intend to capture the Final Fantasy 14 or WoW players? I guess that's the rub, right? Is
Mhm,
that what we're creating is a PVX game.
mhm,
And what that means is our target audience is the PVX player, and that is our golden cohort, right? And so, to a degree, if a player is solely interested in the most elaborate, raid boss mechanics within a controlled and curated setting that is instance gameplay, Ashes might not be the game for that, and that's okay. However, with that being said, we do have a division of curated experiences that exist in an 80-20 ratio. And what that means is roughly 20% of the content that players will experience will be instanced, because where we want to have that granular control
Mm.
over the design and mechanics of a particular storyline or encounter, we utilize the instance setting to provide that, so that players cannot, let's say, zerg a boss, and we can control the setting where those mechanics are emphasized. Um, so it does exist to a degree. But in addition, I think what we may not necessarily leverage in the same fashion that a Final Fantasy does or a WoW does, we do so in other ways by including more dynamic gameplay implications, and how the boss can react and keep things always kind of fresh with our AI systems.
Yeah.
There is a threat of player emergent behavior in those open world settings that you cannot always predict the interactions of the player mindset to the AI behavior or state tree. Those are the types of experiences that we want to emphasize and that we feel is compelling. And it may not be one to one with what a Final Fantasy or a WoW does, but it is a different type of experience that requires a different type of strategy and a different type of engagement that we feel is very rewarding, and that those players might find interesting at an equal level but in a different
Yeah.
way. Without knowing specifics in what you're referring to about those games and the encounters that are created, what I would say is that in our encounter design, we intend for those boss engagements to be compelling. We intend for those mechanics to be interesting and require engagement from the player on both a strategy and tactical level. And we designed those open world engagements to be inclusive of the potential of player activity, player emergent behavior as well. So I think they're going to be interesting. I think they're going to be engaging for the player and not boring or dumbed down. And that's been the direction that the encounters team has had when creating those types of bosses. I think you can look to, as a great example, the raid with Tumak, to give you, and that was a low level raid, to give you the types of mechanics that exist, right? Where you have different types of phased behaviors that exist. You have different types of timed scenarios with the deployment of his tree trunk. You have variable targeting systems that need to be taken into account, with ads that have to be accounted for in very specific methods. You have terrain hazards that exist within those types of boss fights. Like, that is the level of complexity that we anticipate from our open world bosses that we've demonstrated already,
Mm.
right? And then when you think about the types of engagements that we will be utilizing for our instanced scenarios, those will be something that perhaps are a little bit more fine combed towards very reactive gameplay from the players in order to overcome certain types of challenges in the encounter design. The interesting thing about that idea, and who knows, you might see something along those lines, is that the tech to transform the player character mesh into a monster mesh does already exist with the monster coin system.
Mm.
So again, the name of the game when it comes to developing an MMO is, where can you share logic and assets in a in a meaningful way that engages the player with these different types of loops that are interesting. And
Same way
that
with the
particular,
captaincy.
exactly. Um, no, that would be well, in the past we've talked about that combat pet having uh, some amount of power that's either drawn from the player character, or potentially sapping some of the experience in an effort to vertically level up. But generally, yes, I would say that those are horizontal purposes. I don't want to entirely rule out vertical
Mhm.
progression on that, but yes, generally they're horizontal. Originally when we talked about it being more horizontal, that kind of de-emphasizes the necessity for those combat bets to be a part of the encounters. But I think that combat pets for for that being, a downside, it is a worthwhile and desired accompaniment to player achievement and player progression, because you know a lot of people like the idea of having pets, and a lot of people like the idea of those pets being able to satisfy an aspect of strategy or tactics that your class kit may not be able to provide, but gives you access to, especially from a solo ability perspective, uh, um, mechanics wise. So I think it's an interesting system that we won't have too difficult a time balancing the necessity for having those within PvP engagements.
All right, guys, what did y'all think about that Q&A? Leave me down in the comments below, and I will see you guys on the next one. Take it easy, guys.